Hi, it's Richard here from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting with a little bit of a walkthrough of some of the objects that we talked about in the previous two articles. And once we've done that, we're going to look at what we have to do at this stage to be able to execute our flow. And it'll give us an idea of how at the moment we would debug a flow, because as of now, there is no built-in debugging platform for interview flows. I'm sure within the constraints of forward-looking statements and safe harbor that there is probably very much so a debugging platform in the works, but I'm going to show you where we are right now. If you are like me, investigating the new limited release functionality for the web authoring and custom rendering, and you've maybe got your hands on one of the sample projects and you're digging into it. So let's start with a quick walkthrough of the things that we saw in the previous chapters. So I'm going to go over to the projects tab. I'm going to actually search for a particular project called student benefits. I'm sure you've heard of student benefits. I'm sure many of you have watched one of our videos about that example project. So here in the hub, you'll see that I have 4 different kinds of project, and right over here in the policy modeling area, that is actually the original student benefits project that you probably know very well from the example projects. Let's focus our attention onto the other 3 kinds of project. We will begin, as we did previously, with the concept of a flow scheme. Now, every flow project needs a flow scheme. And what is a flow scheme? Well, I look at it this way. Imagine you have 2 teams of people building web product using Oracle Intelligent Advisor. One team is going to work expressly on chat-based, and the other team is going to work exclusively on general web-based. Clearly, those 2 groups of people have different preoccupations. If you're a chat developer in Oracle Intelligent Advisor, you're designing a flow that will look good in a chat. There's not much formatting or layout that you really have to worry about, because in many cases it's the chat client that takes care of all of that. But if you're a web designer, you're designing a web flow, then of course you're going to have different kinds of issues. You're going to want to have a richer user interface. So a flow scheme just defines what a flow author will be able to use when they're working with it. So I'm going to have a look at this flow scheme. So this flow scheme, you can see it has a variety of things, but let's just keep it nice and simple. It has some defined controls. So anybody who wants to design a new flow project using this scheme will be able to use checkboxes, radio buttons, drop-down lists, currency, date, number. It's almost like we're designing a palette of tools that the author of the future flow will be able to use. Many of them are standard. I'm sure you realize that these are completely standard, but they don't have to be. These are some custom flow control contents, or palette contents, if you will, that have been designed to meet a specific requirement. So in this case, you'll see that although it's a label, it has a different name. So somebody's customized a standard label in order to do something specific with it in their future flows. So as an author of a flow, I would be able to place an HTML block in my flow, and that would be like placing a custom component on my flow. I, as the author, don't need to know what the block does. I just need to know that it's available to me. So you might see in the future that people have custom elements which insert the logo and the formatting of their company, or insert standard text, whatever it is. So that's what a scheme does. It gives the author of a flow a tool set. And the tool set is not just things like checkboxes and what have you. You'll also see that a flow scheme can also define data elements. So in this case, it's got a numeric value called existing student ID. So if I'm going to build an interview flow based on this, I'm going to have access to be able to work with existing student ID. And you can see that there are some record lists here, such as defined citizenship statuses, defined enrollment statuses. You probably don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out that this allows somebody to define lists of values in this case. So these lists of values are packaged up inside the scheme so that any author who uses this scheme will have access to these list of values. Now, these are just a few examples, and these are in the demo. In the example project provided by Oracle, these are the existing student ID doesn't do anything clever. There's no kind of data integration, but it's to show you the basics of how to work with a flow scheme. Then we have some fairly straightforward things like, how do we format data within that scheme? What are the text strings available? And then we have a bunch of other stuff in here. I want you to notice that there's a debug URL in here. So anybody who creates a flow based on this flow scheme, they're going to end up with a debug URL that starts with HTTP localhost 8081. And we'll come back to that in a little while. So that's what a flow scheme looks like. So now if I go to a flow, when I open the flow in the designer, this flow has been built using that flow scheme. So the same components are available to me, the flow author. And let's take a look at what a flow really is. Well, a flow is essentially two different things. The flow is, of course, as you'd expect, a variety of, they call them pages and page groups built into a big section. So, pages should be fairly straightforward. Page groups you can think of as, maybe like chapters or stages, and then sections is something bigger than that. And you can see here a couple of interesting things that were pointed out to me the other day in a demo is in this page, you can see that you can actually put inline comments into a page now. So as a rule or a flow author, I can actually put comments on the pages. Instead of having to write them in a Word document and tell people to go and look at them, I can actually just put inline comments right here. You will see that this particular page uses a data action called load existing student details, and it starts talking about the existing student's ID. You may remember that we mentioned that earlier on. It was part of the scheme. So we're going to load existing student details unless the existing student ID is null. So basically, if you start this flow with a null a null student ID, there's nothing to load because it's a new student. However, if the student ID that is provided is something different to null, well, hey, guess what? We're going to go and load in that data about that student. That should sound very straightforward, should sound very familiar, in fact. And as you can see within the flow, within the pages, we have some fairly familiar kind of stuff. We have drop-down lists, and this kind of gray, well, actually it's green, would you believe, is substitution. So these are substitution elements. So gender display text will display substitution text. And you can see over here on the right hand side that selecting a gender will set the value for the student's gender, one of the data items which has been defined in the scheme and therefore I'm able to use in my flow. Much of the rest of it, I should say, although it looks kind of different, how different do you need it to be? It's a radio button with a caption, with an attribute that it's setting a value for. Is it visible? Is it read-only? Is it required? What's the default? And so on and so on and so on. So, designing an interview flow, I think, is going to be just as easy as it is today to design an interview in Oracle Policy Modeling. We're not there yet, but it's pretty impressive how much work has gone on since the initial alphas and betas came out. This is a pretty amazing piece of work to be able to do all of this inside an interview. Inside a web browser. Getting so confused now. So let's imagine that we have committed our changes, if we made any, and we've deployed it. Okay, so we've deployed the student benefit project. So now what? If we've deployed it, surely we will want to actually test it, as you'd expect. So what does it take today to test one of these? So in this next part of the video, we're going to walk you through the steps necessary to download the flow scheme, import them into your hub, and then set up the necessary software so that you can run the example. The reason for this is straightforward. First of all, as we already spoke about in the other articles, the new world is essentially a place where the rendering of the final flow, the interview in the web page, if you will, the rendering is no longer done as it was done previously. In Oracle Policy Modeling, you just press debug or you just deployed and hey presto, you had a bunch of web pages. You had some HTML. Now, that notion of having an HTML or whatever it is renderer, it's been taken out of the flow design and the flow scheme, and it's up to us as developers to choose whatever rendering platform we would like to use. So if we corporately use Angular or Vue or React or whatever it is, one of those JavaScript libraries or JavaScript frameworks, we now have the choice. Whereas previously we didn't. We just got the JavaScript that was rendered by Oracle Intelligent Advisor. So far, so good. The second thing is that as of today in the limited availability product, there is no live mode for flows. There's no way, whilst you're designing the flow, natively to be able to click a debug button or click a run button and see what the flow looks like for real. So those two things being true, the great people at the Oracle Intelligent Advisor team have provided us with not just a sample flow scheme, not just a sample flow, but also a sample renderer. So a bunch of JavaScript code that will render the flow in a web browser. And that renderer is written using Preact, so a well-known JavaScript library. And in order to be able to execute that, we are going to need a Webpack server, and that's why we're looking at the Node.js download page. So it all starts with us downloading the Node.js server onto our laptops, onto our PCs. Pick the most recent version that you can that matches your platform. I think it has to be greater than version 16. I'm not entirely sure, but basically this is version 18, so there shouldn't be any issue. The installation of that will take a couple of minutes, but there's absolutely nothing to do. You just click next. So I'm going to spare you that for now. The second part of the downloads and what have you that you need to do come in two stages. First of all, you need to go into the online help for Oracle Intelligent Advisor and go to where you'll find the flow rendering example. Downloading this zip file will give you a zip file that contains the flow scheme, the flow, and these files written in Preact, this custom renderer that Oracle Intelligent Advisor has been nice enough to give us as a demonstration. You'll also need to install the Flow Engine API. The Flow Engine API will shortly need to be installed so that when you run your renderer, the renderer can communicate with the API and so on and so on and so on. So let's see what that means. Let's download those two files. So I'll download that one and then I'll download this one. They're both very small, and let's take them out and put them on the desktop. So let's take a look at those two files. This one is the Flow API. This one contains multiple things. It contains the two JSON files which need to be imported into your hub. This is the scheme, which you should import first, and this is the student benefits flow, which you can import afterwards. In addition, you will see here that there is a sample renderer. So this code is going to be visualized by the developer in their favorite development tool, for example, Microsoft Visual Studio Code, but we will also then need to use this code to actually drive the HTML that is rendered in the browser. So let's go ahead and sort that out. What I recommend you do is that you, somewhere nice and simple at the bottom of your C drive, that you create a folder, and in there you first of all unzip the file that contains the renderer and the two JSON files. And then go to your hub and do a couple of things. The first thing you'll need to do is you'll need to import the flow scheme first. You can, if you're doing it for just the first time, you can keep the same name. After which you should see this appearing in your hub, the scheme for student benefits. And then you would repeat the import process to go ahead and import the student benefits project. So you do it in that order, the flow scheme and then the flow, because as you learned in previous articles, is each flow needs a flow scheme. Once you've done that, there are a couple of other things you need to do. And the first one is to make sure that when it comes to permissions, that you include as part of the access settings HTTP localhost 8081. So that's going to be the Webpack server that you're going to get thanks to the installation of Node and the custom renderer that's been given to us. So you need to make sure that you have permission to access the API from there. Once those three things are done, let's go back and take a look at our folder again. And this is the content of the zip. What I've then done is in the IA Flow sample folder, I've copied the Flow API zip file into here because shortly we're going to be unpacking this as part of the installation of the example renderer. So it needs to sit in the IA Flow sample folder wherever you dropped your IA Flow sample folder. For ease of typing, I've just tried to keep it in a nice simple location with not a too long set of file names and folder names. So now I'm going to open a Node.js command prompt and I'm going to navigate to where I installed my IA Flow sample. This may take a little while. So now that I've performed that part, the next step is to go ahead and open the example renderer. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open Microsoft Visual Code, and I'm going to open the folder that I was just working in a minute ago. So inside this folder, which Oracle Intelligent Advisor team has kindly provided for us, is all the code necessary to drive the custom render. So what I need to do next is I need to open a terminal window in Visual Studio Code to start up my development server. However, before I do that, just notice here the webpack config.js file. If I scroll down a little bit, there are a couple of things worth mentioning. You may have been wondering why I asked you to put localhost 8081 into your interview settings in the hub. It's because our little server is going to use port 8081. So I'm going to open a terminal window inside Microsoft Visual Code. And when that's ready, I'm going to start the little dev server. This may take a while, but at the end of it, I should have something that I will be able to access by opening my browser and typing localhost 8081. So let's just wait for that. Looking good. So I will now go to my browser and open localhost 808. I won't do it by clicking because my screen recorder will go nuts. So now what we're seeing is the custom renderer built for us by the kind people at the Oracle Intelligent Advisor team. So it's going to help us obtain the necessary authentication to be able to execute our flow. Obviously, the information you put in here will depend upon where your project is. So I'm going to go ahead now. And paste in all the relevant information for my environment and log in. This may look reasonably familiar to you if you've ever played around with the REST APIs and ever authenticated yourself. So now we have a bearer token. And now we are ready to use that bearer token to go to the next step to start a flow action. The project is called Student Benefits. So let's go ahead and get the JSON Web Token. The JSON Web Token is a mechanism used to do secure communication between the client and the server. There it is. So this custom renderer helps us get underway by letting us create a token, lets us authenticate, and so on. So you may recall earlier I said that there was a element in the flow scheme that talked about a student ID. So you would have a different behavior in the interview if you were loading in an existing student than if you had no student at all. So this custom renderer, this custom page that they've built also lets you play with this by saying, well, let's imagine that I didn't have a student ID and let's launch the flow assuming that I haven't got one, or let's launch the flow using one of three different students, because obviously there isn't really an application hiding behind this concept of a student ID. This just gives us an opportunity to execute the flow pretending that we did have data. So if I choose no student, you'll see a representation of the global data that would be used in this particular flow, and you should recognize these as being the list of values that we talked about way back. If I choose student benefit number 1, you'll see right at the top oops, sorry, right at the top, that it adds an existing student ID. And within the renderer, there's some code that will pretend that student ID, I think student ID number one's name is George. So you'll see George show up in the interview as if you were pulling data from an existing student ID in a student management system. Anyway, so let's choose no student and let's start the student benefits flow. With a bit of luck, after a few seconds, your flow will appear. So what can it do? Well, it's a very straightforward basic renderer. You can click the next button. You can click the previous button. You can also use text boxes and radio buttons, drop downs for list of values, and so on. And next. You can also consult different pages in a group of pages. And where appropriate, you can navigate using this kind of, well, you'd almost call it a stages list, but of course they aren't stages, which has been built into the renderer. So I'll go to the next page. I'll say there are 3 people in my family and I have limited resources. By the way, if you don't know what this project does, I strongly recommend that you go and watch the video that we have about the Student Benefits project in its original form, because some familiarity with this will help you understand how this project works. And next, and next, and next, and we reach the end of our project. We can see that it's rendered some HTML, it's rendered some links, we can go backwards and forwards, we can go back and create things. You'll notice that page groups that are no longer relevant are not available because in my case I was a national. I don't need to fill in my immigration status. If I say, on the other hand, other, I go to an immigration status. If I go back and say national, this should all feel very familiar really, but it is essentially custom built renderer running in Preact as opposed to the standard renderer that you got in Oracle Policy Modeling. If I go back to my start page and choose student number 1, I can then restart a new flow and say, okay, let's load a student. Hi, George. So you can see in this case that student number 1's name is George, and it's pulled in some data about George in a kind of simulation of what it would be like if you were running this flow while pulling data in from another application. So far, so good. You'll probably want to go into the sample example renderer and you'll want to go and investigate all the things such as, oh, look in here, there's data about controls, there's about input controls, labels, page management, multi-select. So what a surprise if we go and have a look at input controls, for example. In here, we'll see code that produces HTML. You can see here that they're building a space for errors. If I scroll down a little bit further, we'll see that they're producing HTML output, which will include a label and maybe a text area or a text field. So basically, this is building the user interface. This is part of the custom renderer. Here's another one for Boolean checkboxes. You can see that they're producing labels. It's basically rendering your flow. And to do that, I will recall one last time that it needs access to the Flow API to understand, what controls do you have in your flow, what kind of controls are they, what name are they. So that information is pulled from your flow and used to render this HTML page. So I do appreciate that this is probably kind of a culture shock if you're used to OPM and just clicking debug and seeing, oh look, here's the interview. But you've got to focus your eyes on the big picture. Number one is essentially nothing has changed between what we used to do in OPM and what we do now in this new world, except that we have a choice. We can write any renderer in any language that we choose in order to, for example, align with corporate requirements, or simply because certain JavaScript frameworks or JavaScript libraries are better adapted to certain rendering situations. Not everything requires jQuery and HTML. Preact, React, Angular, Vue, there are reasons why all those JavaScript libraries and JavaScript frameworks exist. Secondly, of course, we need to think that for now we should target obtaining enough knowledge that we're familiar with the concepts. As my friends always say, don't sweat the details. All we need to think about is how we can get ready for the next generation. By being prepared, we increase our value in the market space, and we increase our knowledge of Intelligent Advisor and make ourselves more useful to our customers and to our employers, which is, after all, part of why we do this job. So I hope you enjoyed this run through of how to get your student benefits flow up and running. I look forward to seeing you again soon on intelligentadvisor.com. Bye-bye.